Let's see. I'm 76. That means I was born somewhere between 1940 and 1942 in transit. My parents came from Warsaw, Poland. The generations there have lived there for many, many generations, and each one came from a very large family. In those days, large families were very common. My father was the youngest of 10, and the only ones that survived besides my parents and me were two sisters, one who came to New York in the 20s during it was Depression time. It was a terrible time in in Poland and in everywhere else in Europe. Another sister went to South America. She got married to a man who had a ticket to go to Argentina. And she said, great, we're going to get out of this country. It's so poor, nobody can get a job, nobody can eat. So they get on this boat and they reach land in South America. And the captain of the boat says, okay, everybody get off. So everybody got off. And for a year, they are living in Brazil, thinking they're living in Argentina, because that's where the boat let them off. So you can imagine they learned Portuguese thinking they were learning Spanish. So it took them a year, because all they knew was Polish, Yiddish, and those were the two languages. So that's how they survived. In Europe, only my parents survived. My mother was the youngest of 6 girls. One survived by she was studying in the Sorbonne, it's a university in Paris. Some of you may have heard of it. It's very prestigious. When the war broke out in 1939, that's when Germany invaded Poland and decided that they wanted to keep Poland for themselves. That sister never came back. She married a peasant who was able to give her a visa so that she could hide as his wife. And when they invaded France, she was hiding in with her husband, who was a French peasant. I'm going to sit down a little bit. I hope you can see me. I'm not that tall to start with, so it's about the same height. There are lots of things I can talk about in being one of the youngest to be in the Holocaust. I know you all read Night by Elie Wiesel, and he told you a little bit about life in the concentration camp. But for children, most of them never got to the concentration camp. They were killed before, and I don't know if you know, there were 1.5 million children under 16 who were killed during the Holocaust because they were Jewish. Now, there were a lot of other children of other places that were killed because of starvation or because of battles going on. So I'm one of the few of my age that survived. My parents told me all kinds of things about my childhood that never rang true. But over the years and being in therapy, I found out that lots of things they told me were they thought that they would protect me from the horrors of the Holocaust. But the Holocaust for children who were very young, one horror was abandonment, and many of them were hidden by other non-Jewish families who were willing to take them in. Some of the families treated them well, other families were very abusive. And anyway, what happened to me was that we ended up, for the first year of my life, in Belarus, which is a country right next to Poland. And my parents escaped the Warsaw ghetto, which is, if you read well, you all read the book, so you may be familiar with the Warsaw ghetto, where 1.5 million Jews lived, maybe 2 million, and very few survived. My parents escaped, knowing that this was not a good place to be. And they traveled through the forests in Poland, in the underground, until they reached Belarus. And apparently that's where I was born. Yeah, I'm just going to get some water. I have it right here, Adrian. And then Germany decided to invade Russia. Belarus was part of the Soviet Union. It was under communism, and it was under the dictator Stalin. But the Germans thought they really could conquer Russia. Now, Napoleon tried to conquer Russia. They never made it. What Hitler thought that he could do is very delusional, because Russia is such an enormous country and the winters are so bitter. It makes Rochester look like Hawaii in comparison. So there I was, about a year, and the Germans invaded the city of Vitebsk in Belarus. And my parents said, we got to get out of here because they're start rounding up all the Jews again. And they were part of that rounding up. So they caught the last cattle train going east. East means towards Asia, towards China. And they had no idea where they were going. And they had an infant on their hands. And what were they going to do with an infant? They wished they didn't have this infant. They didn't really want the infant because it was a wartime and it was impossible to take. You know what an infant takes. Any of you have intimates at home. And they traveled on this cattle train for about 3 months, kept stopping and going, and at one point, my father disappeared, and they never told me where he went or how he went, or he was arrested. And my mother got off the train one day to go and get food, and then the train started going, and there I was, sitting in the middle of a cattle car, screaming my head off. Where are they? Where is my mother? And they said, if she doesn't come back, we're going to drop her off at the next stop because we can't take care of an infant. Fortunately, my mother was able to catch the last train of this, last car of that train. Needless to say, these kinds of experiences left a tremendous trauma for me, as it would for any child who is constantly abandoned, or at least that's how the child feels, and never knows when they will come back to get her. The train kept on going and going and finally ended up in Uzbekistan, which is one of the stand countries. I think one end of it is near Afghanistan, and there is Kazakhstan. There's a whole bunch of them, and they're Muslim countries. So that's where they got off. And in 1942, Germany decided that they wanted to invade Uzbekistan, but they couldn't because there were so many mountains that they just never made it. However, there was complete and total starvation. All the food that was manufactured went to the front for soldiers. So I was often left either in an orphanage or a convent, or anyone willing to take care of an infant while my mother either was sick or she was working. She was a dressmaker, and she made clothes for the wives of military people, the military, the generals. With no doctors, no hospitals, no medication, I developed every conceivable childhood disease. I had whooping cough, which now everybody gets vaccinated. Got pneumonia, measles, chicken pox, you name it. And one time I ended up in a coma. And that, even though I don't remember it physically, my body remembers. If anybody knows anything about neuroscience or studied it or read about it, that the body remembers many things that the mind does not. And the new subject of neuroscience is very new, and a lot of people are beginning to study it. And it's been very helpful to me to help me justify what happened. So for many years, I used to wonder whether I made up all the horrible stories that happened to me. And most people don't think that a child who has not been in a concentration camp was not part of the Holocaust, that everything was fine. Well, it was not fine. It was very, very traumatic. It was, I always felt that my parents didn't want me. I always felt that they didn't love me, and that's why they would leave me. And they would never tell me when they would come back. They didn't really even talk to me. They spoke a number of different languages that I learned to understand, but I only learned Russian because I was in daycare or nursery school and they spoke Russian. One of the things that I carry with me that I remember was a fairy tale. That was printed right after the war. If anybody wants to look at it, not that anybody knows how to read Russian. I mean, I don't know how to read Russian right now. but you see that it's kind of worn out. I have other material if anybody wants to take a look at it. Then what happened was the war ended. I had stopped eating when the food started becoming more available. I was such an angry, traumatized child that the last thing I wanted was to eat eggs, and that's all there was. Eat 2 eggs. So I could barely eat a mouthful. So my mother used to cry, "Why isn't she eating? She must be mad at me," which I think she was right. You ever know anorexia is a disorder of mostly teenagers who stop eating because they think they're too fat, even if they're not. The Russians, there were a number of refugees that lived in Uzbekistan. And in 1945, at the end of the war, the Russians opened up the borders and they said, whoever comes from another, you let me know when you want me to stop for questions, because I'm not sure of the time frame here. I just want to go. They went on a train taking them back to Poland, and in Poland they found total rubble. There was nothing left. They went to the street where they had lived. It was a pile of bricks. And we lived in a house that had been inhabited completely. It was a complete house with china in it and a stove, and I had never seen anything like it. And it had been, the Gestapo had lived there during the war until the war ended. Then the Iron Curtain came down. That means when Churchill decided that we and the communists could not get along, and we couldn't get out of Poland to go somewhere else because they were still shooting Jews in the marketplace in Poland. These were Polish peasants. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in Poland also, as there are in many countries now. Some American organization and a Jewish organization from the United States got a bunch of trucks, they camouflaged them, and they took us, and in the middle of the night, see, that part I remember because I was already 6 years old, 5 years old, through the rain, and we had to be very silent, and we had to change trucks all the time until we reached the city of West Berlin in Germany. And they brought us into a refugee camp that some of you may know from, I guess from Night, Eli Wiesel. It was a DP camp, and it was one of the last ones that they started, because a lot of Jews, wherever they could, they went to Palestine or they went to Australia, whoever would let them in. We lived in this DP camp for 3.5 years with nowhere to go. There was no country until Israel became a nation, and then lots of the refugees from the DP camp went to Israel. My father discovered that he had a sister who lived in New York City. Everybody knows New York City, right? In the Bronx. and he tried to come into the United States through a visa, but because of the Cold War and the fact that I was born in Russia made me a communist. I was 5. Big communist I was, very dangerous. So she couldn't get a visa for us. So she went to Canada, went to Ottawa, which is the capital, brought a bunch of money with her, went to a congressperson there and said, here is the money. I want you to get me 3 visas to come to Canada for my baby brother and his wife and child. They're the only survivors in my family, and I want you to bring them over. So money talks, and we ended up, I was 8 years old, and we came to Toronto, Canada. And by then, I was a total wreck. If anybody wanted to know about life in the DP camp, I'll be very happy to give you any specifics that you would like to know. So we lived in Canada for 5 years. That's where I learned English. And they put me in the 1st grade, but I was so tiny from lack of nourishment that they put me in 1st grade and I was almost 9 years old. So I had to skip every other grade until I reached 8th grade, like you. And unfortunately, my father decided, let's go to New York because that's where my sister lives. Now, you know, this is the worst time in your life to move and to leave all your friends and all the people and all the streets and all the language and everything and go into a new culture when you don't have to. But they decided they wanted to be near family. Did they ask me? No. They never asked me. And so I felt like I was a burden to them, constantly schlepping me around. And we ended up in the Bronx. So I came from a school. We didn't have middle school then. We just had 8th grade. From 8th grade, they put me in a Christopher Columbus High School in the Bronx, which had 5,000 kids in it. It was four stories. And I could never get from one class on the 4th floor to the basement where they had music. I could never get there on time. And then we moved to the suburbs. And again, we moved into another high school. And here I am, a grandmother. I went to college, I got married, I had children, I got divorced, then I remarried, and then I had grandchildren, and here I am, and I just gave you an overview of, and I'm really pleased to share this with you because for me, you are bearing witness to what happened. Even though I was not in the concentration camp, I was in a horrible situation where abandonment was a feeling that has never left me. So coming or going or leaving or coming back, it was always a very big trauma. So thank you for inviting me. I appreciate your attention, and it's not something that everybody wants to hear, but I'm always happy to share whatever I know, because most children my age did not survive. They died of starvation, by the Nazis, and so for anyone my age to not be in a concentration camp is not unusual. So if anybody wants more of anything, speaking of, it's so coincidental. Yesterday's Times there was an article about Anne Frank. How many of you read the book Anne Frank? Well, anyway, it's a diary of a girl who went into hiding in Holland. And it's a very interesting diary. And she was about your age, and she lived there for 2.5 years before the Germans found them and sent them to a concentration camp. Now, her home where they hid has become a museum in Amsterdam, and they are trying to increase the size of it because so many people want to come and see it, and they know very little about her. There were some kids who said, "Oh, did she save some Jews?" I said, "No, she was one of the victims. She died in the concentration camp when they found out where she was living." So I'll leave this here for you to read, or if your teacher wants to read it and go over it with you.
So we're going to take some questions. Before we start questions, you mentioned that your parents were moved through the underground when they left Warsaw? When they went through Warsaw?
Yes,
Could you explain that? Because I don't think we've talked about the underground movement and what that was all about.
The underground, the area between Warsaw and Russia was like the Black Forest. There were so many trees that it was easier to hide, and that's how they managed to reach the Russian border. Now, what happened at the border is the Russians didn't want anyone to come in. The Jews didn't want to go back to Poland, where they would certainly end up in a concentration camp. So the Russians gave them a deal. They said, "Listen, you either come in, but we're a communist country, don't forget that, or you go back." And one of my father's sisters went back because she had a baby. And the rest of you are going to Siberia. Now, Siberia is, I think most of you may have heard about it. It's
How many of you guys have heard of Siberia? Okay.
Yeah, okay. Now, as horrible it sounds, a number of Jewish refugees managed to survive Siberia, which was not as bad as what the Nazis did to the Jews. So after the war, some of them just remained there, and others came back.
Any other questions? We're going to open it up now to you guys some questions.
What was it like in the sorry. What was it like in the refugee camp?
What was it like in the refugee camp?
What was life in the DP camp?
Yeah.
Life in the DP camp was every family, it was a bunch of like garden apartments surrounded by barbed wire. And the barbed wire was not to keep the Jews in, but to keep the Germans out from coming back in to finish the Holocaust. When a bunch of Jews get together, the first thing they establish is a school. So whoever knew any Hebrew besides Yiddish, Polish, or Russian went to school and set up a school. They sent me to school. And I had it. I said, I am not going to school to learn Hebrew when the only language I spoke was Russian. I understood Polish, but they were teaching everybody to read Hebrew because they were planning to send them to Palestine as soon as it became a nation. So what did I do at the age of 6? I quit school. I just didn't go. Anyway, they had seats like three. There was a bench, and there were 3 people sitting in front of a desk, and they put me in front of, or between 2 boys who smelled. That's what I remember. Oh, I am not going back and sitting with them. And the reason why they smelled is that they were orphans, and they were living in orphan houses, and then nobody really took care of them, and most of them were boys. There are really very few boys that did survive, because it was very easy to find out who was Jewish and who wasn't, because boys were circumcised, and all you had to do was look. So I quit school, and I hung out with all the, quote, the bad kids at 6, at 7. I never learned the alphabet. And since then, they have tried to teach me how to read Hebrew, and I never got beyond the first letter. Emotionally, I just couldn't do it. One of my big fears was that they would shave me, because everybody had lice. Anybody ever have lice? It's really disgusting. And I used to walk around like this because I had long curly hair. I wouldn't let anybody touch, and I would walk around like this. Don't come near me, and don't cut my hair off, because it's the only thing that I have that belongs to me. The Germans that lived on the outside would come to the barbed wire to exchange whatever they had for a cigarette, because they would get provisions from the Ort or some of the Jewish organizations in the United States. And some of the things that you could get there was the most expensive antiques for a cigarette, for a pack of gum that we had, that were sent to us. And of course, not everybody that survived the Holocaust were holier than thou people. There were some that were not such nice people. They would get like a carton full or a case full of oranges, and instead of giving it out to the children, they would trade it to the Germans for China, for whatever the Germans had to offer. And that wasn't nice. Even though they went through the Holocaust, they didn't turn out to be very nice people. Elie Wiesel, he turned out to be an incredible human being who got the Nobel Prize for Peace. I remember I had stopped eating altogether, and my mother would sit there and she would make one of these big dishes. The silverware in Germany, that each spoon was like a ladle, like huge. And she would sit down with me and say, "Eat." And I would not eat. And once in a while I would take a bunch of food in my mouth, go to the bathroom, and spit it all out. So I gave them a hard time, because I had a hard time. Is there anything else that I can tell you about the DP camp? I was on my own. I almost never saw my parents. They were busy running. My mother was busy helping people learn how to sew. And my father was busy running the DP camp. I guess it's the end of the,
No, we're still going, he just has a lesson. We're okay.
so I was a real miserable kid. And the only thing I liked was when we went to the park and they let us run around, and I would do handstands, and I was always very active. One of the worst times of the DP camp is when Israel became a country. My parents decided they did not want to go to Israel. I guess they figured there would be another war with the Arabs, and they didn't want to go through another war. We had to go through so many different areas before we could get on a plane to come to Canada. It was we were truly displaced people. We really never had a home. I never had a home. My parents at least had a childhood. I had no childhood. We were always running and hiding, and the worst part of getting on a plane was they kept us in a disinfection unit where everything was smelled of ammonia and Clorox, because to make sure that we were not carrying germs into Canada. And I remember trying to go to the bathroom. The bathrooms are open stalls, and I don't know what I did. I probably went to the bathroom outside somewhere so to avoid going there. Anybody else?
How do you think your experience?
Adrian, you want to tell me?
How do you think your experience changed? How do you view life and nature?
How do you think your experience influenced your view on life and human nature?
It's a really good question. There are a lot of wonderful people around, but I don't trust anybody. In my head, I know that people try to help me. People are very loving. My children are loving. I have grandchildren that are just the joy of my life. I never thought I would get married or survive, let alone have grandchildren. But I don't feel joy. Most of my life is spent in severe anxiety that I can't even pinpoint because of so many of the traumas occurred when I couldn't process the material. You know, people would say, well, we have to do this, this, and this. Yeah, well, you go and try to tell a 3-year-old that your mother will be back in a half an hour, and she doesn't come back for 3 months. And so the legacy of that is mistrust and distrust. But it didn't keep me from getting an education. I went to an Ivy League college, which always amazed me. They said, wait till they found out that I don't know anything. That's the feeling that my parents made me feel, that I knew nothing, that they knew everything, and I should have been a good little communist. Now, children are not very good communists. Children are, they have needs. And I had needs, and they didn't recognize it. And they said, you don't appreciate all the things we did for you. I said, I'm sorry to hear that. I appreciate it, but my own story tells me something else. So I know there's wonderful people. I see them all around. I'm seeing a bunch of you here. I mean, you're delicious. This is you're all about 13. It's yummy. It's a yummy age. I never had that. And at 13, I was a wreck. So I spent many years in therapy, in group therapy and at private therapy, and I go in and out of therapy to this day. And I myself became a therapist because I understood suffering. That when you suffer, and you know what that feels like, you can help other people because you can understand how they might be feeling. And it's a terrible, terrible feeling. Or being depressed, or being anxious. It's a terrible feeling. It just colors your whole world. So that was a good decision for me to do that, because I started out as a teacher, and when I had my own children, I couldn't do children 24/7. I just couldn't do it. So I went back to school, which is the one place where I was always happy, because I could do something and I could accomplish something, and the teachers were always nice to me. So it gave me a lease on life. So when in doubt, I would go back to school and get this degree and that degree, but always afraid to get a PhD because I couldn't do statistics. Anybody else?
Did you have a religion that helped you or didn't help you get through it?
Did your religion help you or not help you get
Which?
your religion? Or not
That's a
help?
very good question, because I didn't know I was Jewish. My parents disavowed their religion altogether. And they became communists during the Depression time. My father came from an Orthodox Jewish home. My mother came from not a very religious, but they were Jewish. And that's why they were not afraid to go to the Soviet Union, where religion was eliminated from the culture. And they never told me I was Jewish. And I found out with a name like Maya Rosenfeld, that was my maiden name, in Canada when I was 11 years old. Some kid came up to me and said, "Why are you in school today?" I said, "What do you mean? I go to school every day. You're in school. Oh, aren't you Jewish?" I said, "Am I Jewish? I don't know." And they said, well, with a name like Maya Rosenfeld, where everybody else is Jones and O'Reilly and Brown, and how could you not be Jewish? So I went home and I said to my father, "Are we Jewish?" He said, "It doesn't matter." I said, "Well, apparently it does, because they told me in school I shouldn't be in school today because it's the Jewish New Year, Yom Kippur, and I was supposed to stay home." He says, "Oh, they don't know what they're talking about." So that was the end of my religion introduction. And I knew when I had my own children that it's really important to know who you are. And one of the things that tell you who you are is your religion, whether you are very religious or not religious at all, but it's important to know who you are. And so I decided with my own children to send them to Hebrew school after the regular school, because they needed to have an identity. And I was not a very good teacher with religion. And to this day, I have a very hard time acknowledging being Jewish on a very primitive level. It's always in my head. I know I'm Jewish, and I belong to two different temples, and it didn't do any good. I never learned, I didn't understand prayer. To this day, I don't understand prayer. But I made some really, I go for social reasons to meet people who are a lot of wonderful people. And it's a way of being social and a way of interacting with other people who share something with you. So that is a really good question.
Did you ever build a good relationship with your parents?
What noise here is.
Did you ever build a good relationship with your parents?
No. They, you may, I don't know if you read the little article I wrote that about 25 years ago. And I tried. I once sent them a letter saying, in the name of Yom Kippur, I would like you to forgive me for all the heartache and all the difficulties I gave to you. And could we start out in under a new slate? And they thought I was crazy. What's the matter with you? They had, in the meantime, when my children were about 10 or 11, they decided to retire, and they moved to Florida and left me in New York as a single parent with 2 young children, and they never worried about what would happen to me. And I tried, and if anybody knows any Yiddish, zagunish helfen, anybody, it means no matter what I did or what, it was always the wrong thing. So it's very hard to make a go of it. And it took me years to learn how to be a parent. And therapy helped me a lot with that.
Besides therapy, was there like anything that like helped you get through it? Like obviously you suffered a lot. Was there anything that helped you like get through that? Hope or something?
Besides therapy?
Yeah, is there anything else that helped you cope and
School. I loved school. I always did well. In college, I took Russian, and of course the Russian that I knew was a childhood Russian, so I had to learn from scratch, but it was easier for me to pronounce the Russian words because they're not easy. I think school saved my life, besides therapy. Doesn't mean I liked all my teachers. I mean, I had some really lousy teachers. But in general, there was a sense of accomplishment that I could do something that was right. You know, I'd take a test and I would get a 96 or an A- or B+, and say, see, I'm not stupid the way my father thinks I am, because I don't think the way he does. Well, I appreciate your patience and your attention. It's not all the greatest things that one can share, but I hope I left something for you to think about. I have some photos if anybody wants to take a look. On the day that Israel became a nation, which is 1948, I was in a parade. We walked down Boulevard. I like a major street, like Monroe, or a very wide road, with a flag made out of blue and white paper. And all the little kids would walk down, and whatever refugees there were, everybody was screaming and carrying on. And the Germans were standing on the sideline, very quiet. Nobody said a word. And there I was, and I have a picture of that. I can pass it around so you don't. I was the kid with the miserable look on the face, a plaid coat, and again the clothes that we got were hand-me-downs from the United States. The United States, they were basically the ones that sent us the most provisions, and the UN also tried to help. But then I have a picture of, this is in Uzbekistan, in an orphanage. I was sitting and I had some kittens. This is a picture of an American soldier who was a social worker from Tennessee. He was Jewish. He would come to the DP camps to see how the children were doing, and we called him Dixie because he was from Tennessee. And he would come to our house, bring me a huge Hershey bar. In those days, Hershey bars were not skinny. They were like thick. And I would carry it around, and I would never eat it because I was saving it for later. And of course, later never came. And then the other one is a picture that's very hard to see on the article that I wrote, and this is in Uzbekistan. Here's a picture when we first came to Canada, and I was 8.5, and you can see how tiny I was from malnutrition. This is in Belarus. I was about 8 months old. There's a picture of that. Here are scenes from the DP camp of children, many of them orphans. You can get into different rows. I promise not to embarrass you. And these are here's a picture of me in Berlin when we went to a circus. And I was absolutely horrified when I saw the animals, the way they were being treated and in cages. And I identified with the animals, and I said, I hate the circus. I am never going back. Never. That's why I don't like to go to zoos, because I identify with the animals. I can't stand that. I don't know, anything else? This is in the DP camp. This is a picture of Purim in the DP camp, and I am the one all the way on the left wearing a velvet dress. I didn't want to wear a velvet dress. I wanted to wear a white dress with gold stars on it like everybody else. And so I was furious. And they always picked me because I knew how to memorize poetry, all in Russian. And this is a factory where my father worked in Uzbekistan, and most of the women there were Muslim women.
He's the only man in the family.
The only man. All the other men were on the front in the Russian army.
When you were in Russia, were you in a camp or were you in a neighborhood? What was your experience in Russia?
When you were in Russia, where did you live?
When I was in Russia, we lived in different places, usually in one room. When we were all together, we lived in just different places where the Germans weren't. Don't worry if it's on the floor. It's been through worse times. I have another little anecdote. The way my father found out where his sister lived in the Bronx, he had a jacket that my aunt sent to the family in Poland during the 1930s. This is before the war. And he kept that jacket right through the whole war. And when he got to the DP camp, he said, I know I have a sister somewhere in the United States, but I have no idea where. And he looked at the jacket, and the jacket still had a label on it of where it came from. My uncle, that's my aunt's husband, he worked in a clothing store in the Bronx. And so my father took the address on this label and wrote to the store and said, do you know this person, Jaime Weinberg? And they wrote back to the DP camp saying, yes, we know him, but he doesn't work here anymore. But he works in this other place, also in the Bronx. So when they finally connected, that's when they were able to get a visa to go to the United States. And I remember the meeting where we were flying and landed in Montreal in the airport. And when the family met me and my parents, they were hysterically crying. They were for hours. And I just stood there. It's like they didn't even see me. And I said, I don't know what they're crying about, but I don't know what they're talking. I don't know anything. And I don't know what we're doing. But this was par for the course, because my whole life was like that until then.
You said you weren't. You said you didn't know you were Jewish. So, like, what did you think was going on? Like, do you remember what you thought was going on at the time?
You mean about the Holocaust?
Yeah.
I didn't. I thought everybody lived like that. I never saw a normal life. So, you only know what you know. It was much later. It was much later in my life when I finally discovered that what I thought I had made up stories about myself were really, really happened. I didn't make them up. As a matter of fact, whatever happened was so much worse than I thought, than I could possibly imagine. But that's also a good question for me to think about. You know, what do children think about? They really don't think much of anything except they feel a lot. If you feel scared all the time and you don't even know why you're feeling scared. Because the fear starts so early in life and it stays connected.
What was like the moment that you realized, like, what was the moment that you realized what you remembered you didn't make up? Like, what was that moment?
It wasn't even that long ago. It was in around 1990. Well, about 12 years before you were born. There was an article in the New York magazine, and it was based, I could send this around. My name is towards the end where they talk about the hidden children. And as they describe the hidden children of the Holocaust, when I finished reading it, the article in the magazine, I said, oh my God, that's me. I didn't make this up. And I was already in my 40s, 50s. It wasn't even that long ago. And it was like such a revelation to me. And they started having groups for children that were hidden or whose Holocaust experience was denied. Because it was just so incomprehensible that people would do things like that to children, to kill 1.5 million children because of their identity is beyond comprehension. So when they started forming these groups, I joined some of the groups, and after you read Anne Frank, you'll find out one of the people that was in my group went to school with Anne Frank. And when I heard that, I just got goosebumps all over me. I said, oh my God, it's just so unbelievable that things like that happen within my purview.
Thank you so much for coming and sharing your story with us. We give a round of applause.